Here we have concept question 311. It's from chapter 24. And we are given a table that gives us the demand and marginal cost for a monopolist. Keep in mind that a monopolist marginal revenue is different from the marginal revenue in the case of perfect competition. In perfect competition, marginal revenue is just the price for the unit. The monopolist, however, has to change the price per unit, as we see here in the table, depending on how many units the monopolist plans to sell. So, our goal here is to find marginal revenue. Remember that marginal revenue means the extra amount of revenue you bring in from selling that one more unit. So when I go from selling 0 units to selling 1 unit, how much more money do I have in my pocket now because I sold that one extra unit? So I'm going to use Excel to help me with the math here. Of course, you can do this with a pen and paper, calculator, whatever you prefer. But since I happen to be working on my computer anyway, I'll get Excel to do the math. And so I've already copied in the first 2 columns of the table here. So my output and my price per unit. Now the question is, what is my marginal revenue? Which, of course, like I said, is the amount of extra revenue you have from selling that one more unit. So for me, it makes sense and it's easier to go ahead and add in a new column here where I can put my total revenue, so that I will know how much money I make from selling each of the number of output that's given in the table. And then we can just subtract our total revenue from selling 1 minus our total revenue from selling 0, and we know what our marginal revenue for that 1 is. And similar for 2, we'll subtract the total revenue for selling 2 minus the total revenue for selling 1, and we'll know how much extra we got from deciding to sell 2 rather than deciding only to sell 1. So I make an extra column here for total revenue. And then you just remember, you can think about this as any store owner or as your kindergartner going to school selling pencils or whatever. Your revenue is the price per unit times the number of units that you sell, right? So in the case of 0, our first row here, that's just going to be my 0, which is the number that I sell, times the price per unit at 0, which is 10. So of course my total revenue if I sell nothing is nothing. Similarly, for if I sell 1 unit, my total revenue is that 1 unit times the price of that 1 unit, which is 9. If I sell 2 units, my total revenue is both of those units, the 2 that I sold, times the price of those 2, which the table tells us is 8. And notice, as we expect for a monopolist, the price per unit has to go down when we increase the number of units that we want to sell. And that's because the price for a monopolist is determined by the aggregate demand curve, which of course is downward sloping. So the amount consumers are willing to pay goes down when the quantity sold or quantity demanded or supplied increases. That's just the law of demand. So I'm going to get Excel. I'm going to go ahead and plug in a formula here to get Excel to finish out the table for us. So it's the output times the price per unit. It gives me my total revenue. So I'll have Excel fill that on in. Okay. So now that I know my total revenue at each output level, it's simple for me to find my marginal revenue, right? Marginal revenue doesn't make sense at the beginning because you have to be able to subtract to figure out how much more am I making by selling 1 more unit. So our first row for marginal revenue is always blank, which Excel has a problem with. Yes, okay. Now Excel is willing to put my 2 dashes there to show that I'm leaving that one blank. Now, how do we calculate marginal revenue? It's just the revenue that I get from selling 1 minus the revenue I got from selling 0. And that's my marginal revenue for selling one product, right? Or more precisely, the definition for marginal revenue, or the formula for marginal revenue, is change in revenue divided by change in output. So I know my change in revenue is 9, which is my new revenue, minus 0, which is my old revenue. And my change in output is 1, which is my new output, minus 0, which is my old output. Whoops, 0, which is my old output, right? So I've got change in revenue, 9 minus 0, over change in output, which is 1 minus 0. And I know that my marginal revenue is 9, which makes total sense. If I sold 0, I made $0. If I sold 1, I made the price of that 1, which is $9. So my marginal revenue for deciding to sell 1 unit is that $9. Now, we have the same situation for 2 units. My marginal revenue for deciding to sell 2 units instead of just 1, so increasing my output from 1 to 2, how does my revenue change? So we'll take the change in revenue, 16, which is my revenue if I sell 2, minus 9, which is my revenue if I sell 3, and divide that by the change in output, which is now I'm selling 2 and I was selling only 1. My marginal revenue for that second unit is $7. If I sell 2 units, I make $7 more than if I had sold only 1 unit. So I'll get Excel to go ahead and fill in the formula here for the rest of it. That's the advantage of using Excel to do this math for you. It'll go ahead and do it based on a formula. So I know I want the change in revenue, so I want my current revenue minus my previous revenue divided by my change in, remember you got to keep these parentheses in there though, or you'll confuse it. So I want to make sure that the top of my fraction stays in parentheses and the bottom of my fraction stays in parentheses. So it's the change in revenue minus the change in output. So I'm now selling 3 and I was selling 2. Close parentheses, and Excel does the math. And now that I've got a formula in there, I can just copy that formula down to the rest of the table and find my marginal revenue for the rest of the table. So now it's just a matter of copying those numbers into the original question. So it's 97531. 975 and 1. And we'll check that. And it tells us we did a good job. Next it asks, what would a profit-maximizing monopolist do? How many will they produce, and what will be the price? Remember that a monopolist will always produce at the point where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost. So where do we have that situation here? We have a marginal revenue of 9 with a marginal cost of 1, revenue of 7, cost of 2, revenue of 5, cost of 3, revenue of 3, cost of 4, and revenue of 1, cost of 5. So they're never actually equal on our table, which is probably more like real life, right? Because we can't produce a piece of a unit, and so the price may jump, or the revenue may jump differently than the cost. But what we do know is that as a monopolist, we definitely don't want our costs to be greater than our revenue. So let's go right to as close as we can get to marginal revenue equaling marginal cost without going over. So it's kind of like the game The Price is Right. You want to get as close as possible without going over. So in this case, notice that at an output of 4, we get to where our revenue is 3, but our cost is 4. So we definitely don't want to do that because our revenue is smaller than our cost. If we go back down to an output of 3, our revenue is 5 and our cost is 3. So we're good to go there. So our revenue is still greater than our cost if we produce 3, but that's not the case if we produce 4. So we're going to want to stay at 3. So we want to get as close as we can without going over, just like the Price is Right. So the number that we want to produce, if we're a profit maximizing monopolist, is 3 units. And the price at, 3, not 33. And the price at 3 units, it tells us in the table, is $7 per unit. Okay, so we can check our answer, and we're good to go. All right, so if you have any more questions on this, feel free to shoot me an email or stop by office hours.